Hello, everybody. We're continuing on with our discussion about the relationship between chronic inflammation and uh, neurological brain diseases and cancer. So I think in our second video, this is the third one now, we talked about uh, the chronic inflammation, which is inflammation that doesn't ever really fully resolves and keeps up with this cycle of getting worse and then a bit better and then worse and then better. And how chronic inflammation can lead to some severe consequences in the tissues. So remember that chronic inflammation occurs when whatever it is that's damaging your cells and leading to the inflammation is something that your body cannot fully rid itself of. So whatever's causing this damage, your body can't completely stop it. If it's something like an internal bit of damage that your body can't repair, like a torn tendon or ligament, or like severe arthritis, or if it's infection with certain slow-growing germs that your body can't completely eliminate. You can end up with chronic inflammation, which ultimately is not only damaging to tissues, but can begin a process that ends in something severe like a heart attack or a stroke or Alzheimer's disease or cancer. So I wanted to start actually today with a graphic where I'm just going to show you kind of a general flow chart of what goes on in tissues with chronic inflammation, and then we'll talk more specifically about how chronic inflammation affects brain tissue and can lead to like these serious neurological diseases. Okay, so here's just a little graphic that I did up. You've got a group of normal cells here, but when they're subjected to chronic inflammation, when there's some kind of damage going on here that the body can't resolve, here's what happens. And initially you get what looks like an acute inflammation response, which is where you get extra blood coming in and you get white cells coming in. And remember, the white cells are designed to kill any germs that are in the area, but also to absorb debris from dead cells, because debris from dead cells keeps inflammation going. And so once you kind of fix this problem, then you want to just get rid of the dead cell debris so that you won't have anything there triggering the inflammation anymore. But in chronic inflammation, you can't ever fully do that. Cells keep getting damaged. You can't get rid of what's damaging them, and so the damage continues, which means you're always going to have like some cell debris that's triggering this inflammation and triggering the white cells to put out hormones that cause inflammation. And over time, this tissue becomes more and more abnormal as the chronic inflammation continues. For example, one thing that happens is you get meaner white cells coming in over time. So the initial white cells that come in during inflammation are, not as, they don't produce chemicals that are seriously harmful to the tissues, but as you recruit more and more white cells over time, the white cells that come in later are more lethal. They secrete more toxic chemicals, and they can do damage to healthy cells that are in the area, not just to germs. Also, if this chronic inflammation goes on for a while, the white cells start initiating a process of protein development, where you get these long protein fibers forming outside of the cells here. And those protein fibers that form outside the cells, they can become what we call scar tissue, which is protective but non-functional. It doesn't do what these cells do. But also these protein fibers that get laid down here can initiate bad things happening inside the local cells. So it can cause a buildup of other toxic products inside the cells, which can really damage the cells. So when you have chronic inflammation, you can get this situation where you have meaner, angrier white cells releasing chemicals that are damaging local cells, and also depositing these protein fibers down here, which can start to form toxic chemicals within the cells. And also these protein fibers are not functional, and so you end up replacing a functional tissue with a tissue that doesn't really work properly. Another thing that can happen though with chronic inflammation is you get rapid reproduction of the healthy cells that are surrounding this area. They're trying to reproduce to replace these cells that are these damaged cells that are dying here. But because damaged cells keep dying and you keep getting more damage, that leads to overly rapid reproduction of the cells that are surrounding this area, as they keep trying to replace lost cells and they keep reproducing faster and faster to try to do that. When cells reproduce too fast, they can lose their genetic control. They can end up with genetic damage because every time a cell reproduces, it's got to copy its DNA. And if it has to do that too quickly, it makes mistakes and the DNA code gets altered. It's what we call mutations. And also the normal controls on cell reproduction can get lost over time as you go through cycle after cycle of rapid reproduction. So between those things, the genetic damage and the overly rapid reproduction that's uncontrolled, you can get what's called a tumor. And that's an early stage that can lead you to cancer. Okay, so you can get tumor formation, thickening of the tissue, eventually leading to cancer. You can get continuous cell damage leading to protein fiber deposition outside the cells, which can cause damage inside the cells and also replaces functional tissue with tissue that just doesn't function right. So all of this nasty stuff happens with chronic inflammation. And we're going to use today the brain as a specific example. We'll also talk about blood vessels too. How when this sort of stuff starts happening in brain or blood vessels, that's when you can get like severe chronic neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, or when you can get what's called atherosclerosis of blood vessels, and which can lead to heart attacks or strokes. So first I want to talk about, because there's been a lot of really interesting research on it in the last 10 years or so, is how the brain develops chronic inflammation. The reason we've been focusing on this recently is because up until recently, medical scientists weren't aware that chronic inflammation is something that triggers really bad stuff in the brain. In fact, the thinking among researchers up until 10 or 15 years ago was that chronic inflammation in the brain was actually a pretty rare event. But it turns out it's not a rare event. And it turns out that it leads to this deposition of abnormal proteins on the surface of nerve cells, which are called amyloid proteins, which can actually start interrupting the functions inside of the nerve cells, causing them to not work right, and eventually lead to more and more inflammation in the brain. And that it's this inflammation, this chronic inflammation in the brain, that's probably responsible for a lot of serious neurological diseases that we see, like Alzheimer's or ALS, that they probably begin not with the abnormal proteins, but with what comes before the abnormal proteins, which is chronic inflammation. And it turns out, first of all, that chronic inflammation in the brain is not rare. It's actually relatively common. And there's a lot of things that can cause it, a lot more things that can cause it than we knew about. One of those things is slow infections, mild infections in the brain by either viruses or bacteria, slow-growing bacteria that can't be completely eliminated. So there are certain types of viruses that reproduce slowly that can live in the brain and cause chronic inflammation there. There are certain types of slow-growing bacteria that can live in the brain and cause chronic inflammation there. There's also slow-growing funguses that can live in the brain and cause chronic inflammation there. And these bacteria and funguses and the viruses that hide out in nerve cells, these are very hard for your immune system to completely eliminate. So if you get infected by one of these and the infection is in your brain, that can definitely lead to chronic inflammation of the brain. But there's a bunch of other things that can. For example, one of the slow-growing bacteria that tends to chronically infect the brain, it turns out comes from your sinuses in your mouth. It turns out that if you have chronic sinus or nasal problems like polyps or sinus infections that don't resolve, or if you have poor oral health, like you have periodontic disease, gum disease that you never really treat properly, so it never goes away, that bacteria in your sinuses and oral cavity can make their way into your brain because there's a fairly direct connection between the mouth, the sinuses, and the brain. So they don't have to go very far. And so poor oral health or poor sinus health is actually can cause seeding of the brain with some of these slow-growing bacteria. And more recently, we've discovered a very interesting connection between the intestines and the brain. Now, you'd think wouldn't be much of a direct relationship there because the intestines are so far away from your brain. But we've learned a lot more about how the intestines work recently, and especially about the bacteria that normally live in your intestines. All of us have bacteria that live in our intestines, and mostly those are good bacteria. There are bacteria that help us digest our food, that supply us with vitamins, that help to kill bad germs that can be in food that could give us food poisoning. The good bacteria in our gut can suppress those bad germs and prevent the food poisoning. And so, normally our gut bacteria is actually very good for us. But depending on your diet and drugs you may take and medical conditions you may have, your gut can sometimes get colonized with bad bacteria. And the bad bacteria are bacteria that produce toxins that cause inflammation in the gut. And the gut inflammation then can break down what's called the gut-blood barrier. There's normally a pretty tight barrier between your intestines and the blood vessels around your intestines. But if you have bad bacteria in your gut, by the way, gut is intestines, which is down around where your belly is. But if you have bad bacteria in your gut, they can produce these toxins that cause inflammation at the gut-blood barrier, loosen up the barrier, and allow stuff from your gut to leak out into your bloodstream. And if you have bad bacteria in your bloodstream, they can produce toxins that once the barrier breaks down, the toxins then go into your bloodstream. And then your blood can carry them up to your brain. And some of these bad bacteria produce some toxins that when they reach the brain can cause chronic inflammation in the brain. So through a bit of an indirect mechanism, people who develop leaky gut syndrome from bad bacteria colonizing the gut can end up with brain inflammation because the toxins produced by the bad bacteria in the gut can get through that leaky portion into the blood and then get circulated to the brain where they can cause chronic inflammation and damage. So what this illustrates is the importance of taking care of your intestinal health and your oral and sinus health, because the health of your mouth and sinuses and gums and the health of your intestines is actually related to the health of your brain and can affect the health of your brain directly. Another thing that can cause brain inflammation is high blood pressure. If you have uncontrolled high blood pressure, that high blood pressure indicates that when the blood moves through your arteries, it has to exert a lot of force to get through the arteries. The artery walls are narrowed in some way, and so the blood has to exert extra pressure to get through. That puts a strain on your heart, but when that blood under high pressure hits the blood-brain barrier, that's the barrier that separates your brain circulation from your general circulation. When high blood pressure hits the blood-brain barrier, it can damage the blood-brain barrier. And then toxins that are in your blood but normally do not get into your brain can start leaking into your brain and causing brain inflammation. So high blood pressure is another common cause of chronic inflammation in the brain. Something also discovered very recently, which is really interesting, is how your brain normally cleans its waste. Remember, all cells produce waste. We talked about that. Chemical waste that has to be removed from the cell and then has to be taken away by some fluid outside the cell, so it doesn't build up inside the cell, doesn't build up around the cell. Turns out that your brain flushes out the fluid that surrounds your brain cells, which is called the cerebrospinal fluid, or CNS. Your brain flushes out your cerebrospinal fluid every night when you get into deep sleep. Now, deep sleep here, is stage 4 sleep. Okay, that's the last stage, sleep. Your sleep cycle, which normally lasts between 1 hour and 2 hours at night. Every sleep cycle you go through has 4 stages. There's lighter sleep, which is stages 1 and 2. There's dream sleep, REM sleep, which is stage 3. And then there's really deep sleep, which is stage 4. In stage 4 sleep, you don't dream. It's a very, that's where you're really profoundly, deeply asleep. And a lot of your brain just kind of shuts down. And that gives, by the way, that shutdown period gives your brain a chance to recharge its energy batteries, but also it gives your body a chance to flush out the toxins from the brain fluid, the cerebrospinal fluid. What did I call that before? CSF is cerebrospinal fluid. Anyway, so that flushing of the spinal fluid, where we get the toxins out and replace it with new fluid, which is toxin-free, that occurs during deep sleep. But you can only do it if you reach deep sleep. And remember, that's the final stage of sleep. So some people who have bad insomnia, who don't sleep well and who wake up frequently, almost never get to deep sleep because they don't end up being able to stay asleep long enough or fully enough to reach the stage 4 sleep, the last part of that sleep cycle. And so if you're somebody who doesn't get much sleep or who does but wakes frequently, you may not get to deep sleep at all or hardly at all in any given night. And that means that these toxins in your spinal fluid are building up. And as they build up, they can cause damage to your brain cells, and that leads to chronic inflammation in the brain. So all these things that you wouldn't necessarily think would be related to inflammation in the brain are related. How good you sleep, how you control your blood pressure, your intestinal health, and the health of your gums and sinuses are all related to your brain and how well your brain functions and how well it can clean itself and how much inflammation there is in your brain at any given time. Finally, if you'll remember, one of the major causes of chronic inflammation is autoimmune disease. And I listed that up here as one of the causes of tissue damage. When you have autoimmune disease, it means your white cells, your immune cells, are inappropriately attacking normal, healthy cells of your body and causing them damage, which leads to the chronic inflammation. The reason this inflammation of autoimmune disease stays chronic is because you can't eliminate the white cells that are causing the damage. Remember, the tissue of your body that's meant to eliminate bad cells is your white cells. So if it's your white cells that are causing the damage, white cells can't eliminate other white cells. And so that damage just is going to persist forever and ever because the abnormal white cells are going to keep damaging that tissue inappropriately. Now, it turns out you don't have regular classical white cells in your brain, but you do have cells in your brain that function as white cells, and they're called microglia. So I'm going to show you another picture here. Bring up this picture. Okay, so here's a picture of the brain, and the brain is separated from the blood vessels by a blood-brain barrier. And there's blood-brain barriers all through the brain, but they tend to be concentrated in certain parts of the brain. And it's the blood-brain barrier that keeps some of the toxins that are in your blood from getting into your brain. But then in your brain, you have nerve cells, and here's a nerve cell. But you also have very important support cells for the nerve cells. For example, you've got astrocytes, which are the cells that can feed nerve cells and guide them in their connections. So astrocytes are very important cells in the brain, and particularly in the developing brain. They kind of show the neurons where they're supposed to hook up and lead them to those areas. But you also in the brain have these support cells called microglia. And microglia cells are actually a kind of a white cell. These are the protective cells of the brain. They check the nerve cells for any kind of damage, and if they detect damage, they release inflammatory chemicals to start the process of inflammation, but they can also, absorb cell debris, and microglia can also help nerve cells repair themselves. So if a nerve cell is damaged toward the ends but not in the middle, it can usually be repaired, but the repair requires the help of microglia. So microglia help repair damaged nerve cells. They can absorb the pieces of nerve cells that are completely destroyed. They also, though, can detect infections in the brain and attack germs, and they can detect damage to nerve cells and begin the inflammatory process by releasing inflammatory hormones. So these microglia in the brain behave just like the white cells we've been talking about in the rest of the body. But once again, if you get chronic inflammation situation where the microglia are now activated in a kind of a permanent state, normally microglia are only active for a short period of time and then they deactivate. But if you have chronic inflammation, or you have microglia that have gone autoimmune and are now attacking normal white cells or normal brain cells, then you get this chronic activation of the microglia, which leads to chronic inflammation in the brain, which ultimately leads to the formation of these protein tangles outside the nerve cells, and that's the amyloid, tangles of amyloid proteins. Now, the amyloid proteins themselves don't actually directly damage the nerve cells. In other words, the nerve cell underneath the amyloid proteins can function fairly well. But if the amyloid proteins, if they get too numerous outside the nerve cell, or if they last too long, they can ultimately be destructive. And the way they do that is they cause other protein tangles to form inside the nerve cells, called tau proteins. So if the amyloid plaques are there's too many of them, or they're hanging around too long, they can start the formation of tau protein plaques inside the nerves. And those plaques damage the nerves. They prevent the nerve cells from conducting signals and doing their job. So we have developed drugs, for example, that can eliminate these amyloid plaques from the brain. And for many, many, many years, biologists, neurologists, brain biologists, they thought that it was these amyloid plaques in the brain that were actually causing Alzheimer's. But it turns out that that's not really true. So it was surprising. I mean, one thing that led us to the conclusion that it wasn't really true is we eventually, when I say we, I mean medical researchers, eventually developed treatments that could completely eliminate these amyloid plaques from the brain. And so they gave those treatments to people with Alzheimer's. But although the treatments did tend to slow the progression of the Alzheimer's, they didn't reverse it. They didn't make the Alzheimer's go away. And they didn't ultimately stop the damage. In other words, the Alzheimer's did keep getting worse. It just got worse more slowly. And so that was very puzzling to all the medical biologists who were sure that these amyloid plaques were the cause of Alzheimer's. Because whenever we autopsied the brain of people with Alzheimer's, you always saw tons of these amyloid bundles wherever there was damage. But the reason for that is because these amyloid plaques are essentially like scar tissue. They form in the brain where there is damage. So the only thing the amyloid plaques were really telling you there is that those areas of the brain were damaged. But they didn't tell you what was causing the damage. And it turns out what was causing the damage was not the plaques. They were just indicating where it was. What was causing the damage was whatever was causing chronic inflammation in the brain. And sometimes what that was overactive microglia that were inappropriately killing healthy nerve cells. And so it's not too surprising that these treatments that eliminate the plaques don't actually reverse or stop Alzheimer's, because what's causing the Alzheimer's in that case is autoimmune reaction from microglia. And getting rid of the amyloid plaques doesn't stop the autoimmune reaction from the microglia. In fact, when you get rid of the plaques, all that happens is the microglia go back and start damaging more nerves and making more plaques. So, that explains that. So what if we really want to treat Alzheimer's properly and other diseases that have similar mechanism like ALS, if we really want to treat these properly, we have to treat the ultimate cause, whatever is causing the chronic inflammation in the brain, or whatever, or by getting rid not of the amyloid plaques, which themselves aren't the cause of the damage, but getting rid of, like, say, the overactive microglia, which are causing the chronic inflammation and the damage. So new treatments that they're developing now to try to target Alzheimer's are targeting other things. Some of them are targeting these tau protein tangles that develop inside the neurons that actually do damage the neurons and prevent them from functioning. And some of the new treatments are targeting the active microglia to try to inactivate them. So chemicals we can give people to inactivate their active microglia. And I have a feeling that those treatments will be more effective, although most of them are still in either early stages of development or trials. And so we don't have the full data picture on that yet. By the way, I suppose you could go back one step and ask why we have why some people get overactive microglia in their brains. And there's some interesting research being done about that, because the truth is we don't really know the answer for any autoimmune disease of what starts it. We know a lot of autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis or lupus or vasculitis, or type 1 diabetes. There's tons of autoimmune diseases out there that we know about and we're very familiar with, but in all cases, we actually don't know why the white cells decide to attack those tissues inappropriately? We really don't know the answer to that for any of them. And I think once we discover the answer to that question, what ultimately triggers the white cells to go rogue like that, we'll be much better not only at treating things like Alzheimer's, but all the other autoimmune diseases as well. But for now, we do know that a fair amount of chronic brain inflammation is due to inappropriately overactive microglia. And so if we can shut down the microglia, that probably will have a much greater effect on the development of Alzheimer's disease than, say, getting rid of amyloid plaques, which is a later stage in the disease process and certainly not the most important one. Okay. So again, our new understanding of the relationship between chronic inflammation and brain diseases is leading us down new avenues of treatment, which we hope will be much better than the classical treatments for these brain diseases. For example, nowadays, if we want to treat somebody with Alzheimer's or with Parkinson's, we tend to do what's called neurotransmitter replacement therapy, which is where, we know that certain areas of the brain are getting damaged, and we know that in those areas of the brain, the nerve cells use certain signaling chemicals to function. And so since we're losing nerves in those areas of the brain, we just feed people chemicals that will turn into those signaling chemicals in the brain that the brain is missing. And so we can compensate temporarily for the loss of function. For example, with Parkinson's disease, there's a part of the brain near the center of the brain that dies off, and the nerve cells in that part of the brain release a neurotransmitter or signaling chemical called dopamine. So as the Parkinson's develops, people lose more and more of those nerves, and so they have less and less dopamine being secreted in their midbrain. And so the classical treatment has been to give people feed them a chemical called L-DOPA, which is converted in the brain to dopamine. And so that temporarily improves the signaling in the midbrain because we're replacing the chemical that we're losing from all the dead nerves. But the problem is neurotransmitter replacement does not stop the disease progression because it doesn't treat what's causing the nerve death. We may be temporarily replacing the neurotransmitters that are missing from the dead nerves, but we're not actually stopping the nerves from dying. So neurotransmitter replacement therapy always fails eventually, usually within 6 months to 2 years. Because ultimately nerves keep dying. Ultimately, the death is so widespread that feeding people extra neurotransmitter just isn't going to be enough to compensate for all the loss of nerve cells in that area. So we're experimenting now with other kinds of treatments based on our understanding of chronic inflammation. So one thing is this is the ultimate and the ideal, is to prevent the inflammation from happening in the first place. So for example, if the inflammation in your brain is being caused by your abnormal bacteria in your gut, or an infection in your sinus, or poor sleep habits, or high blood pressure, then the preventatives from some of these diseases would be to, for example, normalize the gut microbiome. And there's a lot of ways of doing that, of getting healthy bacteria back into the gut and getting rid of some of those bad bacteria. That can sometimes be done through a combination of probiotics and antibiotics that kill. So you give somebody antibiotics that kill the bad bacteria, and then you give them a ton of probiotics to replace their bad bacteria with some good ones down there. Controlling blood pressure can be done again through diet, exercise, and medications that reduce blood pressure. Getting better sleep, if you can figure out what's causing the bad sleep, if you help people get better sleep, then that can allow the brain to flush out the toxins if that's been a problem. If gum disease is the problem, bacteria from the gums, then you need better dental care and more vigorous flossing and brushing. By the way, one drug that has been shown to give people better stage 4 sleep is a sleeping aid called Balsamra. Balsamra seems to work. It's a fairly new sleep aid drug, but it unlike some of the other sleep aids, which really don't help people spend more time in stage 4 sleep, Balsamra looks like it does help people spend a bit more time in stage 4 sleep. Another thing that's been fairly dramatic, treatment's been fairly dramatic, is replacing dead nerve tissue, allowing the brain to regrow the parts that have died. Now, normally in adults, your brain really can't regrow much tissue. And that's because adult brains have very few of what are called stem cells. I think we talked a little bit about stem cells before. Everybody has some stem cells, which are what they call embryonic cells. They're cells that are left over from when you were an embryo or fetus living inside your mother's womb. And these cells never developed into your adult organs or tissues. The body deliberately keeps a reserve of stem cells in every organ and tissue. You've got skin stem cells, fat stem cells, muscle stem cells, liver stem cells, intestinal stem cells. Your body deliberately keeps a supply of these in each tissue in order to help you repair injury. So if you get injured as an adult, these stem cells can grow some new tissue and help you repair the injury. Stem cells have the unique ability to develop into any kind of tissue. So you can take any stem cell from anywhere in the body, and if you give it the right environment, it'll grow into nerve cells, or it'll grow into liver cells, or it'll grow into muscle cells, or skin cells. But in adult humans, there are very, very few stem cells in the brain. And so we don't have the ability to really regrow any kind of significant portion of our brain. Any large area of brain damage can't be regrown because we just don't have enough stem cells in our brain. But lately, medical researchers have discovered a few things. One is that they can harvest stem cells from other parts of the body where they're much more common. For example, we can get stem cells from fat tissue, where there are a lot more of them. And once the stem cells have been removed from any part of the body, if you give them the right environment and the right hormones, they'll regrow into the tissue you want them to regrow into. So, for example, we can harvest stem cells from somebody's fat tissue in their belly, and we can let them grow and reproduce for a while in an artificial environment, like in a dish, so that we get a lot of them. And then we can start adding chemicals to the dish, like certain kinds of hormones and growth factors that cause the stem cells to start developing into the kinds of tissue we want, like brain tissue. So in China, they've been successful, it looks like, at treating Parkinson's disease, fairly advanced Parkinson's disease, at least in a few people, by harvesting the stem cells from their fat, growing them so they've got lots of stem cells, and then injecting them into the part of the brain that's missing, that central part in Parkinson's, and then adding growth factors and hormones also to that part when they put in the stem cells so that they start developing into nerve cells there. And the Chinese researchers have claimed that, like, they just did this with, I think, 8 people in a trial, and none of the people died, which is good, from the treatment. And 2 of them seemed to go into complete remission and even regain function, certain movement abilities that they lost. Now, we don't know if that effect will be long-term, if that's a permanent thing or a temporary thing, but still, it's impressive. And ultimately, if we get good at doing this and it doesn't end up killing people, it could be used to treat a lot of different brain conditions, virtually all of them. Even things like strokes. So that's very exciting, the stem cell reimplantation therapies. But again, this isn't fixing what's caused the problem. This is just when there's, when this is what you do when the problem is really advanced and there's large areas of the brain that have actually died off. Then you can turn to something like this. But again, ideally, you want to stop this before it gets to that. Ideally, you want to stop it here before it even starts by preventing the brain inflammation. But if you can't do that, you can do these anti-inflammatory treatments that we're experimenting with. For example, we've known for a long time that people who take powerful anti-inflammatories every day, like ibuprofen or aspirin, don't develop Alzheimer's as much as people who don't take these things every day. And they tend to develop it later. So you might think, well, why don't we just put everyone on ibuprofen and aspirin? Well, that's because those drugs, if you take them every day, have pretty serious side effects. They are blood thinners, they cause abnormal bleeding in the body, and people who are on them every day for months or years tend to have some pretty severe bleeding issues, which themselves can be fatal. So really, you don't want to be somebody who's on this every day. But we have noticed that these things can slow or prevent the development of Alzheimer's. So what they're looking for here is they're looking for anti-inflammatories that don't have those side effects, that really just affect the brain tissue, primarily the microglia in the brain. So if we can give people chemicals that prevent microglia from becoming overactive or from staying active. In other words, if we can get drugs that deactivate microglia in the brain without affecting things outside the brain, that would be extremely useful here, and they are working on that. Another thing they're working on is cell death inhibitors, nerve cell death inhibitors. Remember, cell death is sort of like the end stage of this inflammation process. It can be ultimately brought on by all these abnormal protein tangles inside the cells. But there are chemicals that can delay or stop cell death of nerve cells. One of those chemicals may be a chemical that breaks down the tau protein tangles inside the nerve cells. Remember, that's the protein fibers that form inside the nerves. So they're experimenting now with inhibitors of tau protein development. And there's other kinds of inhibitors too that can stop nerve cell death in other ways. So, these are active areas of investigation for new treatments right now. And all of them really are making some progress. So that's why I really expect within the next 5 to 10 years that we have some very, very good treatments for chronic neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, because I have a feeling that, more than one of these is going to turn out to be highly effective at either repairing damage that's done or preventing the damage from being done. Okay, before we go, I did want to also talk to you about how chronic inflammation can lead to artery disease, which leads to strokes and heart attacks. So this is what causes what's called atherosclerosis, which is partial blockage of your arteries. And it's where arteries are partially blocked that blood clots tend to come and seal up the narrow space that's in the arteries, and that stops the blood flow through the artery and leads to a heart attack if the artery's in the heart, or a stroke if the artery's in the brain. And these are two of the leading causes of human death. So the question, though, is how do these arteries get narrowed? How do these plaques form inside the arteries? Well, it turns out that's also an inflammatory process. In the wall of an artery, where the wall is damaged, you get inflammation. Remember, inflammation occurs anywhere there's damage to tissue. So if there's damage to the inside of the wall of an artery, you'll get some inflammation there. And that inflammation will attract white blood cells and platelets that will come into that area. And the white cells will look for bacteria and they'll look for debris and try to scavenge it up. But when you're inside of an artery, when you damage an artery, the inside of the artery, another thing comes into that area of damage that doesn't come into other areas. And that's little particles of fat called LDL fat. And so if there's damage in the wall of the artery, in addition, you get inflammation, and in addition to white cells and platelets coming in, you also get these little fat particles called LDL particles. They come in too. And they get stuck in that area. They stick to it. And when LDLs are stuck to the inside of the arterial wall, that tends to create more inflammation, more damage to the wall, which creates more inflammation, which brings in more white cells that are nastier, which cause more cell damage, and then the deposition of these protein fibers, and then more fat coming in and sticking to the protein fibers. And so you end up with what they call atherosclerotic plaques. And these plaques are areas of swelling and fat and white cells and protein fibers that grow and start narrowing the passageway. And as they narrow the passageway, first of all, it's harder and harder for blood to get through here, and it's under higher and higher pressure as it squeezes its way through. But also, when the area gets very narrow, it becomes relatively easy for, say, a blood clot, which came from a wound somewhere else, to actually stick in that area, or for part of the plaque to break off and stick in that open area, completely sealing it off. And once that area is completely sealed off, no blood can flow through here, and you start getting death of the cells on this side that are fed by this artery. So this is an inflammatory process. It's chronic inflammation in the artery that leads to this. So what's causing the damage to the inside of the artery? Well, same thing that causes damage other places. Infection, like a bacterial infection or a viral infection in the inner wall, which can happen if you get bacteria or viruses in your blood. But also, a common cause of damage to the inner wall is high blood pressure. If your blood pressure is too high, the force of the blood against the wall is too high, and that can cause the wall to tear. And that causes inflammation. That means there's tissue damage where it tears, there's reaction, there's inflammation, and that gets the process started too. So most common causes of this kind of thing are high blood pressure, infections in the arterial wall. And if somebody, for example, has high fat levels in their blood, if they have a lot of cholesterol, a lot of LDL, that's not going to actually cause the damage, but it will accelerate it. Because if you have this plaque forming here, but you have a lot of fat in your blood, a lot of extra fat, the fat buildup here is going to become faster. And so you'll get to this stage much quicker if there's a lot of fat in your blood than if there's not. So again, this is why doctors like to do blood fat and cholesterol tests, so they can see how much fat is in your blood, which will determine in part how quickly this atherosclerosis develops and gets serious, but also why they take your blood pressure, because as we've seen, blood pressure can cause chronic inflammation in the arteries and in the brain. And by the way, in other organs too, like the kidneys. So, high blood pressure is something that is easy to measure and is very, very important to control. Because if you don't, it can cause damage and inflammation in many vital areas of the body. Okay, so that's our little talk about how chronic inflammation is related to neurological disease and arterial disease, and some treatments, at least neurological treatments, that can help possibly treat it when it's in the brain. All right, and next time we'll talk about treatments and progression of chronic inflammation, how it can lead to cancer, and how this understanding of chronic inflammation can lead us to new treatments for cancer. Okay? So thanks for sticking with me. It was a long one.